Thank you. Thank you, Julianne. Welcome to the Zoom Roomers. We want you to participate fully. If you've got questions or comments, put them in the chat. Julie is really good at keeping an eye on you from her control station over there. We have a very unusual speaker today. This is not a climate scientist person, but this is a climate writer person. And any of you who have lived in Gainesville for any amount of time know Nathan Crabbe as the former opinion editor for the Gainesville Sun. Of course, Gainesville Sun has done away with that position, and we are lucky enough that Nathan has landed with Florida Atlantic University Center for Environmental Studies as the editor of the Invading Sea, which is a really good online newsletter blog. So they feature news and commentary and educational content about climate change and other environmental issues facing Florida. And over lunch we were talking about, is it South Florida centric? And the idea, actually, Nathan is trying to bring it to the entire state of Florida. So that would include us and North. Previously, Nathan worked for the Gainesville Sun from 2002 to 2022. And most of that time, he was the opinion editor. He also covered University of Florida and environmental beats as a reporter. And before that, he worked for Point Park University investigating wrongful convictions for the Innocence Institute. He also covered environmental and county beats as a reporter for the Napa Valley Register in Napa, California. So it's Nathan is a sea to shining sea reporter. He lives now in Gainesville. Apparently he's going to stay in Gainesville and not move to FAU, I hope, with his wife and 2 young children. And it's my pleasure to give a warm oak hammock welcome to Nathan Crabbe. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. I think this is the 3rd time I've been here to Oak Hammock, and I'm always in my previous position as opinion editor for the Sun, I always felt like I was coming among like-minded folks, or at least folks that used to write a lot for the paper. I mean, I'm sure that several of you in this room were folks that have written opinion pieces for the Sun. I know I saw some familiar names up in the Zoom of people that have written opinion pieces for the Sun over the years. So I've always felt at home here. I appreciate being invited back now that I'm in a new position. PowerPoint up. I'm new to this PowerPoint thing, so bear with me here. So I wanted to speak today. I wanted to tell you a little bit about kind of what the Invading Sea does and what I do in my new position, and kind of how it fits within the media landscape in terms of covering climate change. This picture that I included, I heard some people commenting on it while I was sitting here. I believe it's Palm Beach County. When one of the hurricanes was approaching, this guy decided it would be a good time to take a jog. And as you can see, some of the cars are having a tough enough time getting around. So I don't know what the idea was there, but I thought it was kind of symbolic, if you will, of the idea that we kind of ignore the effects and consequences of climate change until they're literally right up at our ankles. So I wanted to start off by kind of laying a little bit of the landscape of American U.S. opinion about climate change and U.S. views on climate change. There's a very good project at Yale University, an Institute on Climate Communication, that's done quite a bit of research on this issue and how people view the issue of climate change. And they did a research study a little over 10 years ago now that's kind of been the basis of a lot of thinking about how people kind of divide themselves into different camps and how they view the climate issue. And they boiled it down into these 6 specific categories. And you can see from the cartoons, they even have little illustrations for each of the categories. So the groups include the alarmed, and that's the people that think that climate change or global warming are a huge issue, one of the biggest, if not the biggest issues that's facing us. It's an urgent threat. We need to do something now about it, and they strongly support climate policies. The concerned are just a little bit lower than that. They think human-caused climate change or global warming is a serious threat, but tend to believe some of the effects of it are a little farther in time, so we have some time to do something about it. The cautious haven't made up their minds. The disengaged just don't know very much about it. And then you get in kind of the more the denier camps. The doubtful don't think it's happening or believe that there are natural cycles that have happened in the world always, and we're just part of another one. And it's not the humans that are causing this. And the dismissive are tend to take that a step further. And we've seen a lot of this in the last several years in terms of kind of conspiracy-minded folks that think, these are climate scientists putting on some sort of worldwide hoax to, I don't know, get grant money, or not sure what the end game is, implement some sort of policies that they don't like. So that's the dismissive kind of falls in that camp in viewing it. But as you'll see, from the most recent polling that they did on this, as someone who deals with climate news every day, I try not to be so doom and gloom, and it's really hard not to be so doom and gloom. What's that? Oh, go on. Oh, sorry, they said get to the microphone. I thought no one heard me. I think that I like to look. You can look at this chart as a half glass full or half glass empty type of way. I mean, is the fact that 22% of the public is doubtful or dismissive about it distressing? Sure. But alarmed or concerned is more than half of that pie. So I like to think that we are, it's taking us a while, and perhaps in our country more so than in other countries, but I like to think that we are reaching some consensus about climate change, and I'll get more into that in a minute here. So one of the reasons I think that opinion is starting to, there's starting to be a consensus that at the very least climate change is actually happening and is caused by carbon and greenhouse gas emissions by humans, is some of the stuff that we've seen, especially in Florida over the last year or so. I think Hurricane Ian was a major event that woke up people to the idea that something needed to be done to deal with extreme weather, or whether or not climate change is specifically influencing hurricanes. There is still some scientific questions about, and I won't get into that specifically, but the idea that as the seas are rising and we're dealing with more extreme weather and rainfall, that we need to prepare ourselves more for it. I think a lot of people were woken up to in Hurricane Ian. Ian really flattened some parts of the southwestern part of the state, but even caused flooding, inland in Orlando. They saw quite a bit of flooding there. So it was a very expensive disaster, and I think that has affected people. But this last month has been, about the doom and gloom stuff, really pretty depressing. And I just grabbed a couple of headlines. July might have been the hottest month ever. When we say ever, we're talking about in recorded history for sure, but maybe going back, tens of thousands of years before it's been this hot as it was this past July. I think that week around 4th of July, when it was setting records, really kind of woke some people up to, ooh, this is not good. And part of that record-setting heat that I think has really started to affect people's perceptions of this issue is what's happening to our coral reefs. And that's a picture there. That's a recent picture that was taken, I believe, by NOAA. And what happens when the temperatures get warm enough in the ocean waters is a phenomenon called coral bleaching that basically kills the coral. And this last month, I believe that one of the buoys on Florida Bay off the southern tip of the state recorded 101 degree ocean water. So it's not even comfortable water to swim in, really, much less what it does for marine life. Some other things that happen elsewhere in this country. I've seen some stories talking about places where climate refugees go. This idea that people are leaving places like Florida to go to other places in the country that are safe from the sea level rise and some of the more intense effects of climate change. And Vermont has always been one of those places that's listed as a place to go. And then these historic rainfalls, this historic flooding that happened there that kind of turned that idea on its head and kind of made some people realize that there's maybe no escaping some of the effects of climate change. I have family up north, and the big issue over the last few months with them has been that these wildfires that are raging in Canada, have transported smoke all the way down into the Midwest and East Coast. I was in DC early in the summer, and they were just starting to get that in early June when I was there, and it got worse after I had left. So I think, again, this idea of people being in different camps, there are folks that are hardcore in their skepticism of this issue, but I think that there are also a lot of people who, as they're seeing effects, are becoming more concerned. So, as we said in the introduction, the Invading Sea, which I'll explain more, is run by the Center for Environmental Studies at Florida Atlantic University. And this center has done different climate research over the years, and starting in 2019 started a survey, the Florida Climate Resilience Survey. And it's a twice-a-year survey. So it's twice a year. It's gone since 2019. So it's kind of giving a good indication of people's evolving opinions in Florida specifically about this issue. And I think that the bottom line of their most recent results is that Florida is inching toward bipartisan agreement on this issue. And inching is a deliberately chosen word because it's slow progress, but I believe it's progress. As you recall, in the state of Florida, our previous governor, it was reported, didn't even want the term climate change discussed. I know that he's questioned that, but I've talked with researchers who worked in some of these state agencies that very much had the order from on high to use other words other than climate change in reports that they did on this issue. So climate skepticism was pretty significant in our state political ranks, at least. But I think that's started to change in the last few years. You can see that a little bit in what's going on in a statewide political level. The climate change still isn't a word that is on the tongues of Republicans leading the state very often, but they do talk about resiliency and some of these other issues that are related to preparing the state for climate change. And I, for one, am happy whatever term you want to use if you're talking about preparing for this issue and dealing with this issue. I'm good with. So this Florida Climate Resilience Survey, its most recent survey was conducted in March. There are 1,400 Floridians, and 90% of respondents believe climate change is happening. So that's good. 65% attribute the causes to human actions, including 49% of Republican voters. And again, we can look at this as glass half full, glass half empty. I'm choosing to look at that as a positive thing. That's more Republicans than ever. That survey has shown that Republican beliefs in human causes, greenhouse gases are responsible for climate change, have been slowly increasing over the course of the survey. And I think I'm going to go back to what I just said before of why these attitudes are changing. I think that in Florida in particular, as we see more effects of extreme weather, I think that's starting to make people more concerned about why that's happening. For example, 77% of the people surveyed had been exposed to at least one extreme weather hazard in the past 12 months. And if it's something like Hurricane Ian that flooded your home, that can be a big eye opener. 61% are moderately extremely concerned about flooding worsening due to climate change. I don't have the statistic for hurricanes, but it's slightly even more than that in terms of moderately to extremely concerned about that. And 52% would be willing to pay $10 a month for infrastructure improvements to protect communities against climate change. And so, again, it's far from a vast majority, but we're starting to reach consensus across the political aisle in terms of this is something we should be concerned about. Maybe we don't agree on all the solutions to it, but there is growing consensus that we need to do something. And this is a quote from a guy named George Riley, who is a former executive director of the Republican Party of Florida, who's now Florida Director of Conservatives for Clean Energy. There's a growing number of conservative groups that are focused on these issues, climate and related issues like renewable energy. And this is a quote from a piece that he wrote for the Invading Sea that was actually quoted, the survey I just mentioned, that Florida is now both a Republican stronghold as well as one of the states in the nation that is most susceptible to the devastating impacts of climate change. All candidates from presidential to city council must recognize the threat that a warming climate means for the state. I just thought that gave me hope that there is folks, People who might have read my opinion pieces in the Gainesville Sun over the years, I tend to be more left-leaning, but I'm hopeful that folks who are more conservative are making this an issue, a priority issue for them, and groups like this are trying to get some other folks in the party, in the Republican Party, on board as well. So I also like to think that in addition to people just kind of seeing what's happening through the weather and the extreme heat and some of these extreme weather events, in addition to that, I like to think that the media is also having an influence on people's perception of this issue. And climate reporting really is better than ever. So, and one of the things I do for the Invading Sea is every weekday I have a news roundup of the climate news that affects Florida specifically. Sometimes I'll have national stories in there, but I really try to keep Florida-focused stories. So I'm asked that I kind of put together a source of top climate news that kind of is closely mirrored to this if you got the handout, but I'm going to mention a couple just sites for folks that are interested in learning more about this issue. You can go to the Invading Sea for a little roundup every morning, or you can go to some of these sites. The Daily Climate kind of is another roundup of climate news that you get a newsletter on in your inbox every day of climate news. EcoWatch is the same. Yale Environment 360, just like that project for climate change communications at Yale, they do some great environmental reporting as well. I put Insider Sustainability down there because it's a business publication, but has some good climate and green energy related pieces. The Conversation is academics, I'm sure as many in this room, who write about their research in kind of a clear kind of way for, easy to understand way for the general public, that has a ton of great climate pieces that they actually allow sites like the Invading Sea to republish, and I do very often, and that's just the URL for their environmental coverage. GRIST is maybe my favorite environmental publication. They do some great reporting that's very solutions oriented, and I think, again, with this climate issue, doom and gloom can kind of overwhelm us sometimes and make some people feel all is hopeless. And I think it's very important to get issues out that are about solutions so that people don't just feel like, well, throw their hands up in the air and do nothing. And Inside Climate News actually won the Pulitzer Prize a few years ago for its climate reporting. They have a new Florida-based reporter, Amy Green, who used to work for the public radio station in Central Florida, who does some great climate reporting. She just did a good piece that we picked up about the Miami-Dade County has the nation's first chief heat officer to deal with the extreme heat there, and very well timed because they've been dealing with heat that's unprecedented there. The streak of days they had of 100+ degree heat index, I think they hadn't seen perhaps ever that many days in a row of it. So my point being is that there are all, that and I will get into the rest of the media in a second, but there are a lot of online sources for people to get this news now, and hopefully that's having an impact on public opinion as well. So in talking a little bit about the traditional media, there is some great reporting being done at some of the news outlets that are still putting out actual physical print papers every day. I don't know, many of you might still get the daily print newspaper. I know I still do, but it's a smaller and smaller group in my neighborhood that I see the newspaper out on their front lawn, and so. But there is some great reporting being done at some of these institutions. For New York Times readers, I'm a subscriber to the New York Times. I don't get the print paper actually for them. I get the online one. They've been doing some great reporting. The Washington Post as well, if you're a Washington Post reader. And the thing that if you're interested in following on this issue that I would recommend is every one of these sites pretty much has newsletters that they put out. And the Times one's called Climate Forward, and Washington Post one that's has one that's kind of a different theme, Climate Coach, which is more oriented on what you can do in your own life to address this issue or address your own contributions to carbon emissions. And then the Miami Herald is really doing, in my opinion, the best climate reporting in the state right now. They have, I believe, a 3-person climate team. And they also put out a newsletter called Stemming the Tide. But I'm part of this group called, well, actually, it's the next thing, I'll tell you that. There's also a group called the Florida Climate Reporting Network that includes the Herald, the Tampa Bay Times, Sun Sentinel, Orlando Sentinel, Palm Beach Post, and other publications and radio stations. And they share climate content. So when one of them writes a piece on climate change, the other members of the group, even though they're from competing publications, can run it as well. And I'll get into a little of the history of how that happened in a second, because it's connected to the Invading Sea. But I'm on those calls that they do every month, and the Herald reporters there always have really important things to share. And before this summer, they bet right. I guess it's not a difficult bet to make that it was going to get hotter, because it's been some of the hottest years on record are in the last several years. So they kind of, before the summer even started, made a commitment to covering the heat issue, which had not been covered as much as the rising sea issue in that part of the state. And they were right to make that bet because of all the heat that Miami has seen. So they've done some great reporting on that, some other stuff as well. I also wanted to point out there's these groups such as Climate Central that are kind of helping reporters get scientific information on this issue. And they created something called the Climate Shift Index. And it kind of calculates how affected the temperatures we're seeing on a daily basis are influenced by climate change. And it really has been off the charts this last month. July 12th was in that really hot stretch. As you can see, Florida is pretty much mostly in that dark red, and especially Miami in that area. And the 5 is the most likely that the temperatures have been affected by climate change. So that's a resource that's put out there for reporters and others. I'm on their email list, and when the index is particularly high for a location in Florida, I'll get an email with that kind of graphic. And they encourage you to share it and use it in your reporting. They put out other studies. They had a study earlier this summer about the amount of mosquito days that are increasing across the, I know, maybe I'm getting a little doom and gloom. The amount of days that they figured the conditions in terms of temperature and humidity that are most conducive to mosquitoes proliferating. And then they did a calculation on the mosquito days and how much they've increased over the last, I think, 30 years in different locations. And not surprisingly, most locations have seen an increase, and some of them in Florida, pretty dramatic increases. So there's another group called Covering Climate Now that, again, is similar in putting webinars and events together for journalists to be connected with scientists and learn more of climate stories to cover. And there's a quote that the founders wrote for a piece that the Invading Sea ran before I got there. Journalists have a responsibility to hold powerful interests accountable for doing what's needed to preserve a livable planet. That starts with telling the truth about the climate emergency, its solutions, and how little time remains before it's too late. So I thought that was a good quote, kind of talking about the urgency of the coverage that I just described. But now, if it's not climate gloom and doom, it's media gloom and doom that I'll be sharing with you. And I'm not a little less half glass full on this one in terms of the traditional print media, at least. Saying the news media faces major challenges is perhaps an understatement. I just grabbed a few random statistics, but 2,200 print newspapers closing from 2005 to 2021. The number of U.S. newspaper jobs falling by more than half during that period. And then the other issue that is perhaps related, but certainly affects the media as well. Only 26% of Americans have a favorable opinion of the news media, the lowest level Gallup and Knight recorded in the past 5 years, while 53% hold an unfavorable view. I think that survey was done last year. So this is where I'll talk a little bit about my previous job and let you know a little bit about kind of the state of the newspaper industry and how it affects our local newspaper here. Gannett owns the Gainesville Sun, the publisher of USA Today, and as they say, more than 250 other dailies in the country, a lot in Florida. The Palm Beach Post, which is pictured there, is I think the biggest one they own in Florida, but the Daytona paper, the Lakeland paper, the Sarasota paper, on and on. A lot of the mid-sized papers in Florida are owned by Gannett. So they've done a lot of cutting and shrinking in the last few years, but I'm focusing here on the opinion content because that's the reason I'm no longer there. Basically, they made a business decision last year to say, we're going to cut back in opinion content, which means not having syndicated columnists that they pay for. So obviously that's a financial thing, and having less people doing the job of opinion editors. And they also, quite frankly, part of their justification was that opinion of the news media statistic that I just shared. The view was, at least as the way that it was explained to me, is that this distrust in the media is in part fueled by what people see as biased reporting. and that a lot of folks who read, consume the media do not distinguish between news content and opinion content. And so their solution to it, I wouldn't have necessarily agreed with. I think you educate the readers on the differences in that content, but their part of their solution was just cutting back on that content in general to, I guess, cause less confusion. So the Gainesville Sun was one of the papers that started cutting back that opinion content last year. My job over the last few months, I became a news editor as well as an opinion editor. And then finally, when I kind of saw the writing at the wall that it was just going to be cut back to nothing, eventually, likely, I decided to take a buyout. That's one of the ways that they've cut back staff. There is offering buyouts to folks, so I took a buyout from the paper last year, and that's why I am no longer there. So thank you. But I'm really happy of where I've landed, and that's the Invading Sea. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that right now. As I mentioned, FAU Center for Environmental Studies runs us. So the history of the Invading Sea is in Southeast Florida back in 2016. It was really driven by one particular opinion editor named Rosemary O'Hara, who was the opinion editor at the time for the Fort Lauderdale Sun Sentinel. Basically said, this is a huge issue of climate change and sea level rise in particular, and we should put aside our competitive interest, meaning all the papers in that region, and start sharing pieces on it, start writing shared editorials on it, start sharing columns on it. So Rosemary got connected with or knew and started talking with the people at the Miami Herald, the Palm Beach Post, and who am I forgetting? Miami Herald, Palm Beach Post, Sun Sentinel, about this, and WLRN, the public radio station down there as well, about kind of working together on this issue, and they formed the Invading Sea. So there was a website that was actually run by her husband, a guy named Tom O'Hara, who had been an editor at the Palm Beach Post before. So he ran the site, and basically the site would take all this content and republish it, and also kind of act as a distributor of it so that all these different papers could share in these pieces. So it started in these papers in Southeast Florida. And again, as I said, very sea level rise focused, thus the name, the Invading Sea. But then they said, well, this is working out pretty well. And the climate change is this thing that doesn't just affect Southeast Florida, it affects the entire state, and it's not just sea level rise. Let's expand it out. So they basically reached out to most of, if not all, the major papers in the state at least, and offered the opportunity to be part of this collaboration. At the Gainesville Sun joined the group, and most of the opinion editors throughout the state of Florida did join the group. And more than 25 news outlets, as I mentioned, and include some of those original ones like the Palm Beach Post and the Herald, but the Orlando Sentinel, the Tampa Bay Times, Jacksonville paper, some papers across the state joined this collective. So there's more than 25 now. And as the group grew to include all of Florida, the issues also grew to include other effects of climate change. Obviously, here in Gainesville, we're facing less sea level rise, not any sea level rise. Extreme heat are the issues, and other issues like that are concerned. So the issues kind of expanded out. And so that's what we do now is so Rosemary and Tom, Rosemary retired from the Sun Sentinel, and her and Tom were running at their retirement, basically said, we want to enjoy our retirement and not do this anymore. So we're going to hand it off to FAU. They hired me to then edit the site. So I've taken over the site now. And we share opinion pieces throughout the state. So if you write for us, we share them throughout the state. And we and what will happen is if I see an opinion piece like in the Tampa Bay Times that I like, I'll let them know I'm going to put it on the site, then I'll share it with all our other partner newspapers, or people will write directly for us. We'll put it on the site, just share it with everybody as well. But the whole idea is amplifying these messages out there that we kind of put aside again our competitive interests and share these pieces with everybody instead of keeping them all for ourselves, because we all need to deal with this issue. So that's kind of my message for today, and I'll wrap this up shortly so we can kind of get to questions. But my message is take advantage of places like the Invading Sea and other places that allow you to kind of speak out about this issue, and use social media to further amplify your message. I don't know how many of you are keen on social media. A lot of people aren't, and I certainly understand that. But it also is the way, as this Pew Research study said, is that half of American adults either often or sometimes get their news from social media. So when you see climate stories that you think are important, sharing them on social media is a way. A lot of people are getting to the news now. They go on social media rather than the local newspaper to find things. So rather than just have all disinformation on social media, you need to share good information as well. Studies have shown sharing these stories can lead people to being engaged politically and take more active roles in their communities. And I just put a couple tips here as we're wrapping things up about climate communication. This is some research-backed climate tips that I've included in there, and picked a couple others from a different source as well. I mean, using authoritative scientific information is important because of so much of this information that you use, peer-reviewed studies and research, when making the case, making it relevant. Again, if I'm writing about climate change in Gainesville, writing about sea level rises, other than the climate refugees fleeing South Florida, some of which may be in this room, the real issue that it affects us is things like extreme heat and those sort of issues, and extreme rainfall too. I mean, it's not just the heat here, but obviously there's a lot of different climate-related issues. But whenever you're writing about, make it relevant to wherever the audience is. Framing it as a public health issue, I think, is important. Emphasizing the near-term benefits. Both those things can go hand in hand. When we're reducing pollution, we're not just reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but we're reducing pollution that has effects on people's breathing and lungs and that sort of thing too. Telling a story, I think, is important. You get bogged down in statistics about climate change and your eyes start to glaze over. So telling stories about how people are affected is important. Harnessing emotions. This is, there are people who, this climate refugee issue is one. It's folks from Puerto Rico after one of the big hurricanes hitting there, moving to the mainland, to Florida because of this issue and how that affects their lives. There's a lot of emotion in stories like that. Making it visual. I think that, like that first image of the guy running in the rain before the storm. I think some of those visual cues and graphics tell the story well. Convey the problem and solutions, and I think that would be my most important thing to convey in terms of climate communication. We can't let people get hopeless and just throw up their hands. We need to show that there is still time to, we might have baked in some of the most serious consequences of climate change, but there is still an opportunity to make sure things don't get even worse than that we need to take. Empower people and give them ideas of what to do, whether that's political action or not. And the last two also touch on that, focusing on opportunities and mobilizing action. I'm naive enough to think that our opinions still matter to our political leaders, and that if we do something in terms of organizing and I shouldn't say naive, hopeful enough to think that they can have results, cause results. So I would encourage people to focus on what those results might be. So thanks, everybody. I put up my contact information here. That's the website, and it's pretty simple, www.theinvadingsea.com. If you want to get the newsletter, we put it out once a week, and it's just kind of a collection of the top stories that we've run in the previous week. And that's a bit link to it. But if you go to the site, you can go all the way down. You can sign up for it there, or if you hit that bit.ly/the Invading Sea newsletter, you can sign up. And if you are on social media, it's pretty simple. Again, the Invading Sea is our handle on both those sites. And if you follow us on both those sites, I always put up whatever the latest piece is up on those sites too. If you don't want to go to the site, you can go there. So thanks everybody for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions and have conversations. Thanks.
Your turn. Got a real opportunity here.
Thank you, Nathan. Ooh, that's loud. I have a concern about public education of climate change. In my years in education from the 1950s right up to retirement time, there was always in the objectives of curriculum, interdisciplinary, social studies, science, math, social studies, reading. There was always some objectives for the student to be able to distinguish the difference between fact and fiction. Now that would be big for literature and language arts and reading, but also in the realm of politics and sociology, dealing with climate change in that respect, dealing with the change, distinguish between fact and opinion, meaning fiction or nonfiction. I see a great opportunity that seems to be missing here in this piece is what can we as parents and citizens do to try to support the efforts in education arena, public schools, to emphasize once again somewhere in the curriculum distinguishing between fact and fiction, fiction and nonfiction. And that touches climate change as well as it becomes a political arm.
Yeah.
So are the papers doing anything to try to get media in the public schools' attention, like providing copies of exemplary newspapers and periodicals in the media centers or in the hands of the teachers for use in classroom instruction?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I mean, I can't speak authoritatively on this issue, but I know some. I mean, I think all of us who live in Florida are kind of familiar with what's going on with the public school system, and so getting some of this stuff into public schools at this point is a pretty explosive issue. I think that right now, there have long been media efforts by the big media companies to get their publications into the hands of young people. When you subscribe to the New York Times, if you're on vacation, they ask if you want to contribute to the newspaper in the classroom program and this sort of thing. The reality is that most, if not all, young people don't even know what a newspaper is anymore. So they're getting their media from online, and they're getting it from social media, where I think the point that you illustrate is a big issue in terms of distinguishing misinformation and disinformation from scientifically based or factual information. My personal view on it kind of goes beyond this climate issue, is about media literacy, and would be that is the thing that if you're going to teach anything in schools in terms of the media, you need to teach people to be able to discern what different sources are. If you go to a source that has reporting that's fact checked and that is citing peer-reviewed sources and citing experts in the field, that's something that you take more seriously than some dude on Facebook or Twitter who's just giving you his opinion, as you say. So I do think, to your point, that media literacy is something that to be taught in the classrooms. Whether that's being taught, how it's being taught, I guess my impression, it's not being taught much, and it could be more what to do about that. Elect folks that care about that issue, elect folks that are not. I think that right now the concern with some of our political leaders is about indoctrination in the classroom. So I think that if you were to say, oh, we should teach more kids about climate change in the classroom, they would probably recoil from that. So maybe the avenue is just to teach media literacy and people to understand where they're getting their sources from. So that would be my thought, but thank you for your comment.
Thanks again for a wonderful presentation. I am interested in really how the media is received by the general public, especially people who are not educated and don't want to sift through the material themselves. And I get a very clear picture that you are also. But what I'm interested in is, there are associations and scientific communities generally who are trying to serve as kind of gatekeepers on what is inappropriate release of perhaps preliminary scientific research. They're so concerned about the cynicism that is bred in the public when they read something like, yes, it's climate change, when really people don't know yet definitively. And I wonder if you had a word to say about what's going on in the media generally about trying to parse scientific information and when it's safe to release information. I noticed, for example, that by the time you gave us these PowerPoints, I already saw a newspaper article, I think it was in the Gainesville Sun this morning, but it might have been the Times, that said that this summer is the hottest on record, and it is due to climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge issue. I thank you for your question. It's definitely an important one. I think some of those organizations that I cited, covering Climate Now and Climate Central, that is why they were formed, for that very reason that you described. Is that, I'll be honest, I'm not a scientist. I don't pretend to be a scientist. I've done a lot of environmental reporting, so my pitch was always that I helped scientists who are brilliant but often not great communicators translate their research to a wider audience. So that was always my pitch, is like, hey, I might not understand the complexities of your research, but neither does most of the general public. So explain it to me as I might explain it to them, and I can help you translate it and bring this a wider audience to attention, bring it to their attention. So, but there are a lot of different efforts going on. In addition to those organizations I mentioned, the conversation is really good about doing that sort of thing. But in terms of the issue of what you attribute to climate change and what you don't, I think we're moving more towards the idea that at the very least, the temperatures we're seeing and the heat we're seeing, if you look at a chart, there's they call them the climate lines, I think. I'm trying to think of the exact term for it, but there's a chart that shows the hottest years on record, and you can kind of see over the course of the 20th century, the lines get redder and redder and redder until the hottest years on record are all in the last 20 years, with the last 10 years especially being the top of that. So I think that at the very least we can say, I think there's more confidence in reporting, like you just said, that this summer. Now, even this summer, there is other factors at play. It's an El Nino year. I even printed a piece from the conversation talking about an effect of an underwater volcano on the temperatures that I hadn't read until then. But I think even with that stuff, even talking about El Nino and some of the other there's solar fluctuations, even there's all these different complicated factors. But even with all that, it's hotter than it's ever been. It's been getting hotter every year, and so I think reporters are increasingly confident to attribute, based on scientific research, that climate change is the driver of all this. All these other factors make it even worse. That's why we've seen such a crazy month this month, is because these other factors are also contributing. But the climate change is long-term the factor that is the biggest concern in some of this stuff. So
I need your help then, Nathan. As a media person, you're appalled at the distrust of the media. As a scientist, I'm appalled at the distrust of science.
I agree.
How are those related? I mean, do scientists, you're mentioning the media reaching out to scientists and helping them translate in some of the scientific results. How should it go? Should it go both ways? That scientists should reach out to media. I have some results. How should I present it, or help me present that? Should the media go to scientists and say, "What have you found about this that we can help report?"
It's a great question, and it is my central concern right now. That the beauty of the Invading Sea being run by a university center rather than by media outlets is, I think, gives an opportunity to address exactly what you just raised. And that's what I'm trying to explore as we kind of figure out how does the site evolve, is working with researchers more on translating the research we were just discussing earlier. We're putting out these very short videos in some of these topics, because everyone has young people especially have a very short attention span, so you can like harmful algal blooms. We made a 1-minute video of that, just so if someone's clicking online, they can see be quickly up to speed on it. So what you're describing is something that I'm trying to figure out more, and trying to figure out what that looks like through a site like ours. Is how do I get the research? Do I translate the research? Do I put it in their own words? Help them translate it? Do we do it visually? Do we do it through audio or video? So I guess the one part of the answer to your question is yes, we're trying to do that and need to do that more. But I think to your broader point about distrust in media and scientists in general, I think is a reflection of a broader mistrust of institutions in our society. And I think certainly over the last 5, 6, 7 years, that has become more pronounced, that the idea that the elites or the academics are working against the average person, or are part of this conspiracy to keep average folks down, kind of thing. I think it's a broader problem that I'm not sure if either of us is going to be able to solve it. So I'll try to solve the problem, or work on the problem that you cited, and trying to work with researchers more and do exactly what you suggest. And I appreciate that thought.
My voice always goes away. I'm a practical person. I'm not a scientist, but I'm wondering, in our world, there's so many islands they're sinking. And what do you know about the islands that are in Chesapeake Bay? Are people gone there, or are they still living there?
To be honest with you, I don't know. I'm very Florida focused on what's happening with climate change, so I can't speak about Chesapeake Bay, but
Okay.
basically anyone in coastal areas, the sea level rises are already been documented, and that's the thing to the skeptics. It's already been documented that sea levels are rising. Now, whether the projections are accurate or not, I think is, there are some differing opinions on how much more they'll rise, but they're already rising, will continue to rise. So anyone in coastal area, it's certainly an issue to be concerned about.
Yeah, actually, the sea level rise issue, Bob Bernstein will be our speaker in 2 weeks exactly on sea level rise. So be sure to come to that. You'll be next. I've got someone over there.
Yeah, we should talk. If that's your topic of expertise, we should talk afterward.
Also, seagrasses. That's your man.
Another one. Yeah, I mean, geez, yeah, there's a lot of depressing news there too, but no doom and gloom.
Thanks for the nice talk. Sorry, I had to step out a little bit, so somebody may have asked this, but are there factors such as industry or possibly political groups that are actually actively working against climate change? And could you speak to that?
Oh, absolutely. The oil companies, in particular, but certainly there are other groups as well. The oil companies, certainly the one that comes to mind in terms of, funding disinformation. There are entire research institutes that are funded by the oil companies and other folks whose interest is preventing, regulation of them. And they've sown this idea, I think that this idea that there is, debate about the causes of, whether carbon and greenhouse gas emissions are contributing to causing climate change. They sowed that information for years and years. So I think that part of it is starting to be less. I think that they're doing new tactics now in terms of, what about China is the one that I hear a lot from. And I agree with that to a large extent. What we definitely need to make sure that the international community is doing something. If we reduce our emissions and China doesn't, it's not going to help a whole lot. So I don't disagree with the idea that we need to focus on that, but it's oftentimes the new kind of distraction from us doing something is, if they're not doing something, well, no one should do something, which I obviously do not agree with.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful session and very informative. I do have a question, though. One of the things I always loved about your opinion column was the opportunity to exchange views in the paper with letters and articles and so on that actually were from both sides. And, there was a lot of kind of pretty good-natured debate going on in the newspaper that allowed people to, from different sides of the aisle to, look at each other and say something. The problem with trying to write something for, your organization or to share things on Facebook is you're kind of preaching to the choir in a way.
Absolutely.
And, how do you cross that bridge and try to get some information out to the other side?
You are absolutely right. I think that is one of the major, if not the major problems that I worry about in terms of this site. I am actively trying to reach out to the aisle, across the aisle to folks. And I know, in fact, I think that it's more important in some ways to get conservative opinions about this issue out there, because that is an audience that needs to be reached. And there is different language that reaches that audience. I'm putting together a panel for Florida Climate Week, which is coming up, kind of talking about this very issue of how to talk to conservatives about climate change. I don't have the answer, so I'm bringing a bunch of conservatives in to give their opinions. But one of the things I've heard is that doom and gloom thing is not a good message that resonates with conservatives. Actually, competitiveness with China is an issue that resonates with conservatives. Again, I think that if we're talking about clean energy jobs and wanting to have more clean energy jobs here, that's a great issue in terms of that maybe that's not something that's emphasized much among more left-leaning folks, is the economic benefits of all this and how that works out. So I think you are absolutely right. I've been meeting and talking with conservative groups. There's a growing number of conservative groups, especially among young people. and they have different ideas about how you solve this, and that's fine. I think that I am agnostic to how this is solved. I just want this to be solved, and if it's Republicans that want to make clean energy jobs their issue, and that becomes their number one issue in Florida, I'm happy with that. Let them take all the credit. They're probably going to be running this state for years to come anyways. It's not a purple state anymore. It's a red state. So if Republicans in the state want to make this their issue and take charge of this issue, great. I'm happy to give them a platform, and I'm trying to give them a platform this week. In fact, I've run a couple conservative pieces. I'm running another one tomorrow. So I'm trying to do what you say. I'm not sure if there are a lot of conservatives necessarily go to the site, but once you put, I publish something like that, I share it on social media, and it actually, among the conservative green energy and climate related groups on there, those pieces get a lot of attention and currency. And when they've been picked up, for example, the one piece by that George Riley guy that I cited, who was a former Republican Party head, we published that piece that got picked up by the Tampa Bay Times and other publications. And then the letters in the Tampa Bay Times over the next days was, I'm a conservative and I care about this issue. It was refreshing for me to see another conservative viewpoint on this and along those lines. And in Florida, we have a long history of conservatives caring about environmental issues. These land conservation programs in our state that were done on, a lot of that work was done under conservative administration. So the environment has been a bipartisan issue in the past. Things have been very polarized in recent years, so it's been more difficult. But I, once again, remain hopeful that we can make this a bipartisan issue again. So,
Zoom room, Zoom folks, questions, comments?
Just a couple compliments there for Nathan in the chat. They've missed you. Glad to hear your news.
Yes. Okay.
I noticed that, when crisis events pass, we don't keep up, and some of that is due to media coverage. But I wonder if you have anything to say about any kind of post-op on the Nestle issue with the water aquifer. It's disappeared from any kind of public debate that I've seen, and yet it's still very much an issue. I don't care how much it rains. Any word on that?
Well, I just ran into somebody the other day that works with one of the Springs groups, talking about how they're continuing the legal action, basically trying to. They've been successful, but the state is not necessarily doing everything that they're supposed to be doing based on the last ruling. And I think they're going back and pursuing some legal avenues to get that to try to get some action on that. I can't speak in great detail, and I might have even got the facts a little bit wrong about that. But I'm just telling you what I heard to somebody at One Love restaurant the other day. But to your point about that not being on the radar screen, I think is a shame. I think that the reality is when I ran pieces on the Springs, specifically about the bottled water issue, they were among the most popular pieces and widely shared pieces. And in fact, it's not in this region we care about our Springs very, very, very much. And so here it really resonates. But there are people around the world that come here to see these Springs. And so when one of those pieces would go out, you would see internet traffic on it spike, because there would be all these different groups who were concerned about Nestle in particular, because Nestle's doing funny business in all sorts of different parts of the world related to water, but because also people really care about the Springs. So I think it's a shame. The Gainesville Sun had an environmental reporter for many years, then they get eliminated to that position, and then they just have a very small staff to cover those issues, so they don't get covered as much as they did in the past. So and that's certainly unfortunate.
So apropos of that, I know I had promised to bring petitions for the right to clean water amendment to the Florida Constitution, and I just checked with Julianne. She'll be able to send that around to the members of this particular class. You can feel free to duplicate it and pass it around to your friends as well. And the idea is that we have laws on the books to protect our water, but our state government is not doing their job. And by putting an amendment on that lets a private citizen say, sue the state of Florida or the Department of Environmental Protection because they're not doing their job, it gives some teeth that we don't have right now. It's a shame that that's a solution to the problem, but that, and that is completely a nonpartisan effort. We all want clean water to drink. Thank you.
Yeah, and there are groups, Florida Springs Institute up in High Springs, there's great groups working on this issue locally, so.
Yeah, they are great. Okay, any other questions? Zoom folks, any other questions? Some more comments? Okay. Okay, thank you very much. couple of housekeeping things. Nathan, good job. Thank you so much. Take the message, talk about it. Next week is natural resources. Excuse me just a second. Hello. Folks, next week is economics, natural resources, and climate. The week after that is sea level rise. And Dr. Sassaman, who's going to do paleo-humans adaptations to climate change, will be on Monday, August 21st. And I'm sure Julianne will send that out multiple times so that you know. Thank you very much. See you next week.